Let's talk about the insurrection, the coup attempt, the terrorist attack that occurred at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. The events of Wednesday, January 6th were the inevitable conclusion of years of disinformation, hate-filled rhetoric, demagoguery, and fear-mongering that was led by President of the United States, Donald Trump. It was perpetuated by his administration, his campaign, and his family, further perpetuated by the Republican leadership, Republican members of Congress, and the Republican National Committee, by state Republican parties, and by many other elected Republican officials across the country. These lies were further perpetuated and regurgitated on a 24-hour cycle by conservative media propaganda outlets and various YouTube personalities, and shared on Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Reddit, and other social media platforms, and ultimately acted upon by countless Republican voters, QAnon believers, and white Christian nationalists. Trump incited this insurrection. This coup attempt was at his direction, and then he did nothing to stop it once it started. It is being reported that he was gleeful as he watched his supporters storm the Capitol building. Many Republicans encouraged this insurrection up until the moment it happened, and then they have barely condemned it after the fact. And it's not just a few Republicans. It's not the minority. The leadership of the Republican Party peddled these lies. They lied about the election and election fraud without any evidence. They lied and said that Trump won the election despite every state certifying their election results, showing clearly that Joe Biden won the election. And this election was not close. Joe Biden won by the same electoral college margin that Trump beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. And Biden received 7 million more votes than Trump did. Let me be as clear as I can. This disinformation, the lies, the hate fomenting, the fear-mongering did not start under Trump. The Republican Party, conservative media outlets, and personalities have done this for years. Things like, Obama isn't American. He is. COVID-19 isn't a threat. It is. The Democratic pedophile ring doesn't exist. Vaccines don't work. They do. Climate change isn't real. It is. Democrats are communists. They aren't. Widespread voter fraud exists. It doesn't. The election was stolen. It wasn't. Everyone associated with the Republican Party over the last 10, 20, 30 plus years who said things like, oh, it's red meat for the base. It's appealing to the base, the base, the base. And they never spoke out against it, never called for the unequivocal denouncing of the racism, bigotry, and hatred that has been at the core of the Republican Party for decades, is complicit. It's time that Republicans own this and reflect on what role they played, not just recently, but over the last few decades. Years of disinformation, anger, fear, and hatred culminated in the attack that we witnessed on the Capitol building. The people who stormed the Capitol knew that they had the support of the president and Republican lawmakers because they'd shown their support for other episodes across the country, where individuals stormed state capitals protesting against having to wear a mask. Imagine that. These folks are so entitled, so fragile, that during a global pandemic, they took up arms to storm state capitals to protest mask mandates and stay-at-home measures that were meant to save lives. And they did it in part because they were fed lies that the coronavirus doesn't even exist. It wasn't just that, though. Remember the caravan of Trump supporters that nearly ran Biden's campaign bus off the road?
The FBI is investigating after a pro-Trump convoy surrounded a Biden campaign bus in Texas as it traveled along Interstate 35. In a tweet, President Trump celebrated the drivers, writing, "In my opinion, these patriots did nothing wrong."
Yeah. Many Republicans like Marco Rubio cheered that on too.
And Senator Marco Rubio had this to say last night.
Listen, I saw yesterday a video of these people in Texas. Did you see it? All the cars on the road with the... We love what they did, but here's the thing they don't know. We do that in Florida every day.
Now, after the insurrection at the Capitol, Republicans are acting as if they had no part in all this. And in perfect alternate reality fashion, they are trying to blame the left, Democrats, the media, and their favorite boogeyman, Antifa, for the attack on the Capitol. Utter insanity. Their disinformation campaign didn't even take a break for a day after the violent attack on the Capitol building where multiple lives were lost. As soon as Congress was back in session later that night, Republicans were still trying to overturn the election. They were on the House and Senate floors spreading more lies about who was responsible for the attack on our country and our democracy.
Showing that some of the people who breached the Capitol today were not Trump supporters. They were masquerading as Trump supporters, and in fact, were members of the violent terrorist group Antifa.
They have continued to perpetuate these lies online and in the media. They haven't stopped. This is despite the fact that countless MAGA people live streamed the assault and bragged about it while it was happening. While it was happening. This evidence is clear. We know who did this. Republicans know who did this. But they will continue to lie about this, just like they have lied about countless other things. We must not allow Republicans to gloss over this moment and try to absolve themselves of the responsibility. Very few in the GOP have clearly spoken out against this coup attempt. Most are out front leading the disinformation that led to the insurrection. And now, many of them are just trying to say, hey, let's move on. I don't remember them saying that we should just move on from the attack in Benghazi. And that was an attack against the diplomatic compound in Libya, not the seat of our democracy, our Capitol building, and members of Congress. Some Republicans are going even further to try to stand against the Democrats' efforts to hold Trump accountable for inciting the violence at the Capitol and to remove him from office. They're even imploring that President-elect Biden to try to convince congressional Democrats to just let it go. Perhaps one of the most egregious statements came from the Congressman Kevin Brady of Texas. He posted on Twitter saying, "Those calling for impeachment or invoking the 25th Amendment in response to President Trump's rhetoric this week are themselves engaging in the intemperate and inflammatory language and calling for action that is equally irresponsible and could well incite further violence." This is akin to saying Osama bin Laden should not have been held accountable for his actions on 9/11 because it may have brought more terrorist attacks against our nation. How on earth can anybody possibly try to equate the incitement of the insurrection and the terrorist attack on the Capitol building, where multiple lives were lost, and put the members of Congress's lives and their staff at risk, with trying to hold the inciters of that violence accountable? Doesn't make any sense. The two are not the same at all. They are not equally irresponsible. One was an incitement of a coup attempt at our nation's capital. The other is trying to hold those responsible for the attack accountable. This is shameful. But there is no bottom for these folks. We cannot let Republicans get away with this. Now let's go back to the insurrection and talk a little bit about who was there. Who were these people? Most of these folks who stormed the Capitol, they believe they're patriots and that this is their American Revolution moment. They were so sure that they were on the right side of history and that they were live streaming and taking photos of them breaking the law. You can't make this stuff up. They were proud of what they did. And they didn't even really know what they were doing. There are countless interviews with folks who stormed the Capitol, and it's quite clear that they didn't really think this through at all. Some folks didn't have a plan. They didn't really know why they were there, what they were going to do, and what they were going to do once they got into the Capitol building. What was their end goal? Did they think that they'd storm the Capitol and just convince Congress to overturn the election, a power that Congress doesn't even have? It's crazy. On the other hand, though, there were some that clearly did think this through. Some men were armed. Multiple bombs were found. Molotov cocktails were discovered. And there was some men with zip-tie handcuffs. Were they planning on taking hostages? Were they planning to kidnap members of Congress? A Capitol Hill police officer in an interview said, "That was a heavily trained group of militia terrorists that attacked us. They had radios. We found them. They had two-way communicators and earpieces. They had bear spray. They had flashbangs. They were prepared. They strategically placed 2 IED pipe bombs in 2 different locations. These guys were military trained." I don't think many people fully appreciate how bad this could have been, and how this could have been a mass casualty event with multiple members of Congress ending up dead. Some erected gallows outside the Capitol building with a noose, and they were recorded on camera talking about finding Mike Pence and hanging him. It must be noted that President Trump, on more than one occasion, made it clear that Pence was working against him and was trying to convince his supporters to pressure Pence to do the right thing. What was that right thing in Trump's mind? I guess overturning the will of the people and overthrowing our government. There are also attacks on members of the press who are there to document the insurrection. Trump has repeatedly called the press the enemy of the people. We were just lucky that no journalists were killed last week. There must be serious investigations into how this was allowed to happen. Why weren't there more Capitol Police and riot police on site? Why did it take so long to mobilize the National Guard? Who was holding it up? Was it Trump? It seems that based on early reports that Trump was holding the military back, showing that he personally was responsible for not protecting the Capitol. He wanted to give his people every chance that they could to make their coup a success. There must also be investigations into multiple videos of Capitol Police letting the insurrectionists in, taking selfies with them, and moving out of the way so that they could get that much closer to members of Congress. And we must explore how the violent insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol building, assaulted police, killed one officer, threatened members of Congress, ransacked offices, stole documents and laptops, were then able to just walk out the front door and go home.
We've been in there, there ain't nothing going on in there. Not right. Yeah! We will not give up.
They walked out the fucking front door after storming the Capitol building and trying to overthrow our government, while George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and so many more are dead. It is the understatement of the century to say that it's white privilege, but it also shows some complicity among some Capitol Police. Just as we know that there are racist cops, there are also QAnon supporting, Trump supporting cops as well. We saw a few Capitol Police that were complicit. Imagine if it was even worse than that. Imagine if some heavily armed men came into the Capitol and the Capitol Police helped. Imagine if men with badges and guns who should have been there to protect members of Congress ended up taking members of Congress hostage. Or ended up killing members of Congress. Or what if a foreign adversary tried to exploit the situation and held hostages or harmed members of Congress, or used the chaos as an opportunity to infiltrate the government computers, files, bug offices, or worse? It sounds like a bad Gerard Butler movie, but all of that easily could have happened. We are so lucky that this was not a mass casualty event, because the way events unfolded, it easily could have been. Let's be clear. This was the greatest national security failure since 9/11, and it must be investigated and people must be held accountable. Now, there were many Capitol Police who served bravely in the face of extremely difficult circumstances. Many were injured, and as I said, one sadly was murdered. These terrorists, many of whom were wearing Blue Lives Matter apparel or carrying blue line flags, were beating police, and they beat one to death. It's clear that the Blue Lives Matter crowd was never really about blue lives at all, and it was just code for we hate black people, and black lives don't matter. Let's talk about who these insurrectionists were. These were white Christian nationalists. These were QAnon believers. These were Republican voters. They were people from all walks of life, from military veterans to returned Peace Corps volunteers. It would not be a stretch to say that the majority of the terrorists were Christian. Yet I don't hear anyone talking about radical Christian extremists. Why is that? This must be discussed. If black or brown people stormed the Capitol like these people did, we know the immediate response would have been extremely different. But we also know that the aftermath would be different. Republicans would be talking about Muslim bans, immigration bans. There would be surveillance for years in Black and brown communities. They would be called all kinds of horrific racist names. Now, I'm not advocating that similar actions be taken, but we must address the serious threat that Christian nationalist extremists pose in this country. Something that I think everyone needs to realize is that there are white Christian nationalists at every sector of our society. Teachers, lawyers, judges, doctors, elected officials, secretaries of state, military police, etc. They are everywhere. For years, many in the evangelical Christian community have preached that Trump was put in power by God. They told their followers that God was acting through Trump and that he was God's vessel. So for many of these insurrectionists, it was as if they were fighting a holy war. There is little difference between these people and jihadists. Where are all the think pieces and headlines about radical Christian extremism? I haven't seen many. Now, let's talk about the Republican Party some more. If you had even the slightest thought in your head that maybe the Republican Party would get better after Trump, let me burst your ridiculous bubble for you. The GOP unanimously approved and appointed Ronna McDaniel again as the Republican National Committee chair. McDaniel is a Trump loyalist, and under her tenure, the Republican Party lost the House, the Senate, and the presidency, so they aren't keeping her around for her winning record. Then there are new Republican members of Congress. One, Mary Miller, a representative from Illinois, in prepared remarks given outside the Capitol building just a day before the insurrectionists took over the Capitol, praised Hitler. Another member of Congress, Madison Cawthorn of North Carolina, has a history of saying white supremacist things, and is a Hitler fanboy. He traveled to one of Hitler's old vacation homes and posted a pic on Instagram with the caption, "The vacation house of the Führer. Seeing the Eagle's Nest has been on my bucket list for a while. It did not disappoint." Then there's Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. She has a history of saying horribly racist, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic things. She's also an open believer in the insane QAnon conspiracy theories, much of which is built upon anti-Semitic tropes. And we can't forget about Lauren Boebert of Colorado. Boebert's a gun nut. She's had some trouble with the law and has been arrested multiple times. Most recently, Boebert released a video just days before the insurrectionists seized the Capitol, in which she proudly stated she would bring a gun into the Capitol building with her, something that would violate DC law. These people are the future of the Republican Party. I hope Republicans are proud. Now, I wanted to address a trend that seems to be happening in conservative circles where folks keep saying things like, well, what about the BLM protests? Stop making any comparison between Black Lives Matter protests and the insurrection we saw last week. Black Lives Matter are protesting so that Black people can live. These insurrectionists literally want to kill us. They want genocide. This isn't hyperbole. It's a fact. Look at all the Nazi paraphernalia on display, the racist remarks. They want minorities out and white Christians to dominate. That is what white supremacy and Christian nationalism is all about. And then there's all this bullshit where people are trying to both sides threats from the far right and the far left. Let's unpack this for a second. The quote-unquote far left wants equal rights, healthcare for all, a living wage, and a protected planet. The far right, and honestly it isn't even the far right anymore, wants genocide of minorities, Christian nationalism, and white supremacy. There is no comparing the two. Besides, the majority of Black Lives Matter protests across the country were peaceful. And we know that police were much more violent against unarmed peaceful protesters than they were against armed, violent insurrectionists. For everyone who said it can't happen here, I hope you finally woke up. America is not exceptional. It did happen here, and it can and likely will happen again as long as the Republican Party and conservative media are allowed to spread their disinformation and propaganda, and Republicans continue to be the anti-democracy party. My greatest fear is that Republicans watch this insurrection, this coup attempt, not in horror, but in glee. They saw the power that they wielded, and they were excited by it. They are excited by the possibility of what they can do in the future. They saw just how far their violent and hateful rhetoric can go. And now, some are thinking, how else can they use this power to their advantage? Some are wondering, can we succeed next time? We must do all that we can to make sure this never happens again. The first thing we can do, and we must do, is remove Trump from office immediately. Every day Trump is in power, he is a threat to this country. He can do tremendous damage while remaining in office. For the health of our democratic republic, for the future of our nation, we must set a precedent that this can never happen again. We must send a strong message to future generations and a clear signal to the rest of the world who is watching in horror at what happened and what unfolded last week, and seeing just how fragile the US really is. Trump must be held accountable and removed from office. So far, Twitter and Facebook have held Trump more accountable than Congress. That's unacceptable. We must also ensure that every Republican in Congress who helps spread the disinformation about the election, foment fear, hate, and violence is also removed from office. Then we must get to work on addressing the rot that's at the core of this country and the majority of the Republican Party. We must oust every single public office holder who is clearly anti-democratic. This doesn't just mean in Congress, but also state representatives, governors, mayors, etc. The rot runs deep, and people who eventually become members of Congress or the president often start in local office. In the short term, we have an inauguration to worry about. We must ensure that the inauguration of President-elect Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris is safe and secure. And as sad as it is to say, it may be better to hold the inauguration not at the Capitol building as is tradition, but instead in some secure, undisclosed location and broadcast it online. All necessary precautions must be taken to ensure the safety and security of the incoming president and his administration. In the longer term, we need to build up our institutions, increase civic education and critical thinking skills in our schools to help prevent the spread of disinformation. And we must end partisan and racial gerrymandering that allows so many of these demagogues to rise to power. We must also find a way to hold conservative media outlets, talking heads, and commentators accountable for their lies and their incitement of violence. Every day they spread hate-filled propaganda that fuels the fear, anger, and violence in this country. They must be stopped. I'm not endorsing this at all, but the US government has spent millions of dollars and literally used drone strikes to kill foreign propagandists who are deemed a threat to this country. I'm not saying that domestic propaganda should be killed or harmed in any way, but domestic propaganda today is a far greater threat than any foreign terrorist propaganda is. It must be dealt with. And each one of us, we also must bear some individual responsibility. We must do a better job of calling shit out when we hear it in our daily lives. Racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, any types of comments, sneers, attacks that happen, we can't let them go unnoticed. It only emboldens these people. Ultimately, we need to come to terms with the fact that this is America. This notion that this isn't who we are is a fantasy. This is who this country has always been, founded on violence, genocide, religious conversion, and slavery. We have a significant population in this country that is racist, hateful, and violent. They wanted to overturn the government. They want to see Christian nationalism. They want white supremacy. And they are armed and dangerous. There is an active insurgency in this country right now, and we must treat the situation as such. The white Christian nationalist domestic terror threat is real. It is here, and it is now emboldened after their recent attack on the Capitol. We need to take this situation seriously and recognize that this isn't the end. It's only the beginning.